The first spadeful of earth was a promise. It was also a betrayal of the quiet that had settled over the cabin since the burials. The dirt, still cold from the long winter but finally yielding to the April thaw, made a soft tearing sound as Alara drove the shovel in with the heel of her boot. She tossed the soil onto a growing pile, the dark mound a stark contrast to the pale, bleached grass of the meadow. Beside her, Boro, a great shaggy dog whose fur was the color of burnt pine and snow, watched with intelligent, patient eyes. He sat with his paws tucked neatly beneath him, his head cocked as if trying to understand the geometry of the hole his girl was digging. He did not whine or bark, but every so often he would let out a low sigh that fogged the cool air, a quiet commentary on this strange new ritual. The hole was not a grave. It was the beginning of something her father had only ever drawn in the back pages of his journals. A thing of stone and air and fire he called a heat chamber. A Roman idea, he'd written, for a northern problem. Ilara had found the journals tucked in the small wooden chest at the foot of her parents' bed, the leather covers worn smooth, the pages filled with his elegant, spidery script. She'd spent the first week of her solitude reading them by candlelight, the silence of the cabin pressing in on her. His words were not about grief or loss, but about physics and geology, about the way heat rises and stone holds warmth like a memory. It was a language of logic in a world that had ceased to make sense. The digging was an answer to the silence. It was a way to keep moving. She was not merely digging a cellar. She was excavating a precise network of trenches directly beneath the cabin's floorboards, a project that required her to first pry up the planks her father had laid a decade before. The cabin was small, just a single room and a sleeping loft, built on stone piers that lifted it 2 feet off the ground. It was into this crawl space she descended each morning, the damp earth smelling of worms and decay. Boro would lie at the edge of the opening, his nose twitching, a furry sentinel guarding the entrance to the underworld. Within a week, her work had a witness. Silas, their closest neighbor from a mile down the valley, stopped his wagon on the track that ran past her clearing. He was a man carved from oak, his face a roadmap of winters endured. He leaned on the fence post, his eyes narrowed against the glare of the morning sun. "What in God's name are you doing, girl?" he called out. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. Ilara emerged from under the house, wiping dirt from her brow with the back of a gloved hand. She was streaked with mud, her braid heavy with it. "I'm making a change," she said. Her voice was quiet, unused. Silas spat a stream of tobacco juice. "A change? Looks like you're trying to bury your own house. That's the foolishest thing I've ever seen a body do. You'll flood your own foundation come spring rains. Your father, bless his soul, built this cabin high for a reason." "I have a plan," Ilara said, looking not at him but at the dark opening under the floor. "A plan," Silas scoffed, shaking his head. He gestured with a thumb toward the dense forest that ringed the meadow. "The only plan a person needs in this valley is a good axe and a strong back. Summer's for wood. You'll need 10 cords at least to see you through. You're wasting good chopping time digging holes like a badger." "My wood will be dry," she said, more to herself than to him. "Everyone's wood is dry in August," he chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Wait until the deep freeze in January, when the snow's piled to the eaves and every log is cased in ice. Then we'll see whose wood is dry." He shook his head one last time, climbed back onto his wagon, and flicked the reins. "Don't say I didn't warn you." The wagon creaked away, leaving Ilara in a cloud of dust and doubt. She stood for a long moment, the weight of his words settling on her. He was right. It was foolish. She was 17, alone, and she was digging a hole under her house based on the theoretical drawings of a dead man. But the thought of another winter like the last one, the relentless, creeping cold that even the roaring stove couldn't fully beat back, the damp wood that sputtered and smoked, the ice forming on the inside of the window panes, was a fear greater than the fear of failure. She picked up her shovel. The dirt was waiting. Boro nudged his wet nose into her hand, a silent vote of confidence. She went back to work. The project consumed her spring and bled into the long days of summer. It was a slow, brutal education in physics and endurance. The design in her father's journal was deceptively simple. A deep, stone-lined firebox built outside the cabin foundation on the west side. From this firebox, a main channel, 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide, would run the entire length of the cabin. 2 smaller channels would branch off from the main one, looping around the perimeter before joining together and venting out a low, wide chimney on the east side. The entire system of trenches would be capped with enormous, flat fieldstones, forming a new floor that would absorb the heat from the smoke and hot air passing beneath it and radiate it gently, constantly, into the room above. A section of this heated floor, partitioned off in the crawl space, would serve as a storage area for her firewood, ensuring it stayed perfectly dry. Finding the right stones was the first great labor. The valley floor was littered with them, but she needed flat, strong granite, not the brittle shale that flaked apart. She and Boro walked for miles, following the creek beds, her eyes scanning the landscape. When she found a suitable candidate, the real work began. She used a system of levers and rollers, peeled logs her father had left stacked by the woodpile, to move stones that weighed hundreds of pounds. It was a painstaking process of inches and feet. She'd pry the stone up with a long iron bar, slip a roller underneath, and then push, grunt, and shove, her muscles screaming in protest. Boro would trot alongside, tongue lolling, occasionally nudging a log with his nose as if to help. She moved over 200 stones that summer, one by one, from the far corners of her meadow to the growing pile beside the cabin. Her hands, once soft, became a landscape of calluses, blisters, and cuts. Lining the trenches was the next phase. She used smaller, more manageable rocks for the walls, fitting them together like a 3-dimensional puzzle. She learned the language of stone, the way a wedge-shaped piece could lock a course, the satisfying thud of a perfect fit. She mixed her own mortar from clay she dug from the creek bank, sand, and ash from her cook fire. It was a primitive mixture, but her father's journal had noted its surprising durability. Day after day, she descended into the cool, earthy dark, her world shrinking to the narrow confines of the trench, the smell of damp earth, and the gritty texture of the mortar. Above, the summer sun beat down on the valley. The air grew thick with the drone of insects, and the scent of cut hay drifted from Silas's fields, a reminder of the season she was letting pass her by. The community, small and tightly knit, watched her with a mixture of pity and concern. Martha, who ran the small trading post in the village 5 miles away, would press a loaf of bread or a jar of preserves into Alara's hands when she came for supplies. "Child, you're thin as a willow switch," she'd say, her brow furrowed. "Whatever it is you're building, it can wait. You need to eat. You need to rest." Mr. Abernathy, the wealthy landowner who held the mortgage on half the valley, was less gentle. He saw her one afternoon, struggling to move a particularly large capstone. He reined in his handsome horse, looking down at her from his lofty saddle. "That's your father's daughter, all right," he said, though it wasn't a compliment. "Always chasing some fool notion instead of doing sensible work. I've got a mind to call in the note on this place. It's no land for a girl alone, especially one with rocks for brains." Ilara didn't look up. She jammed a lever under the stone and threw her entire weight against it. The stone scraped forward 6 inches. "This is my home," she said to the granite. A new voice cut in, softer than Abernathy's. "Looks like you could use a hand with that." It was Finn. He was a trapper's son, a few years older than her, with quiet eyes and a way of moving through the woods as if he were part of them. He'd been watching from the edge of the trees. He slid off his own horse and walked over, ignoring Abernathy completely. He was tall and lean, and he studied the problem for a moment before picking up the second iron bar. "If we lift at the same time," he said, "we can walk it into place." Ilara looked at him surprised. He wasn't mocking her. He wasn't questioning her. He simply saw the task and offered his strength. Together, they levered the massive stone, inch by painstaking inch, until it settled perfectly over its section of the main trench. Abernathy snorted in disgust and rode off. Finn stayed. He didn't ask what she was building. He just watched her work, his curiosity plain. He started stopping by every few days, sometimes with a brace of rabbits, sometimes with a sack of nails he'd traded for in town. He'd sit on a log, sharpening his knives, and watch her lay the stones. He spoke little, but his presence was a comfort, a silent affirmation that she wasn't entirely mad. "My father drew it," she told him one afternoon, finally offering an explanation. She showed him the journal, the elegant drawings, the precise calculations. Finn traced the diagram of the firebox with his finger. He was a smart man. He looked from the drawing to the half-finished structure. "You've got good hands. You're building it true." By the time the first aspen leaves began to turn gold, the system was nearly complete. The trenches were all lined and capped, forming a solid new floor of dark, mottled stone under the cabin. She had built the firebox with thick, insulated walls of stone and clay, and the chimney on the far side rose a modest 4 feet, capped with a flat rock to keep the rain out. The final, crucial step was to relay the wooden floorboards over the new stone one, leaving a gap of 2 inches for air to circulate. The stone would be the source of the heat, but the wood would make it a home again. She split the last of the summer on her woodpile. While Silas and the other men in the valley had spent months felling trees and hauling logs, Ilara had focused on a smaller, more manageable supply. She cut and split enough for what she calculated would be a normal winter, about 5 cords. But instead of stacking it outside, exposed to the elements, she hauled it, piece by piece, into the newly created storage chamber under the cabin floor. It was a dry, dark space, directly adjacent to the main heat channel. The idea was that even the residual warmth from the system would be enough to keep the wood bone dry. As the days grew shorter and a chill crept into the nights, she sealed the final floorboard into place. The cabin looked the same as it always had, but beneath the familiar pine planks lay a secret of stone and ingenuity. She swept the floor, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. The work was done. All that was left was the waiting. All that was left was the winter. She lit the first fire in late October. The morning was sharp with frost, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. She loaded the firebox, a small, efficient chamber that held only a few logs at a time, and lit the kindling. For an hour, nothing happened. The fire drew well, the smoke pulling cleanly through the unseen channels, but the cabin remained cold. Silas's words about foolishness echoed in her mind. She sat on her stool, her hands wrapped around a mug of cooling tea, and stared at the stone floor, feeling the first bitter pang of failure. Boro lay with his head on his paws, whining softly in his throat. Then she felt it, a subtle shift in the air. It started not as heat, but as a lack of cold. The chill that always seemed to emanate from the floorboards was gone. She knelt and pressed her palm flat against the stone she'd laid near the firebox end. It was warm. Not hot, just a deep, pleasant, living warmth. She moved across the room, pressing her hand to other stones. The warmth was spreading, a slow, underground river of heat. By midday, the entire stone floor was radiating a gentle, even temperature. The cabin, which had always had cold corners and drafts, was filled with a consistent, comfortable warmth that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Boro, sensing the change, stretched out on his side on the stones, groaning with pleasure. Ilara laughed, a sound that startled both her and the dog. It was the first time she had laughed in months. She had done it. Her father's drawings, her sweat, the hundreds of stones. It worked. The first snows came in November, a light dusting that melted by noon. The valley settled into the rhythms of winter. Smoke rose from every chimney, a sign of the constant battle being waged against the cold. In other cabins, stoves roared day and night, consuming enormous amounts of wood. In Ilara's cabin, a small, steady fire in the outside box was all it took. The stone floor became a vast, gentle radiator. She could walk barefoot in the dead of winter. The windows remained clear of ice. When she needed more firewood, she lifted a trapdoor in the floor and retrieved logs from her subterranean woodshed. They were perfectly, impossibly dry, and they burned with a clean, hot flame. Her neighbors remained skeptical. "A bit of warmth now is one thing," Silas told Finn at the trading post, loud enough for half the village to hear. "But wait for the great winter. The old-timers say we're due for one, a storm that'll bury this valley for a month. Then we'll see how her little stone trick holds up." The whispers of a great winter grew as autumn deepened into true winter. The old-timers pointed to the signs: the squirrels' unusually thick coats, the early migration of the geese, the way the bark on the north side of the oaks was thicker than anyone could remember. A sense of foreboding settled over the valley, as tangible as the ever-present smell of wood smoke. The storm arrived in the second week of January. It did not come with the fury of a blizzard, but with a quiet, ominous stillness. The temperature dropped steadily for 2 days, plunging to 10, then 20, then 30 degrees below zero. The sky turned a flat, metallic gray, and then the snow began to fall. It was a fine, dry powder that hissed as it hit the frozen ground. It fell without wind, a relentless, vertical descent that seemed determined to erase the world. For 3 days it did not stop. The valley disappeared under a blanket of white. The snow piled up against doors and windows, burying fences and woodpiles. The world shrank to the 4 walls of a cabin. For most, this was a familiar hardship, but this storm was different. The sheer volume of snow, combined with the brutal, persistent cold, created a new kind of crisis. Woodpiles that had seemed enormous were quickly entombed. The logs, when they could be dug out, were coated in a thick layer of ice and saturated with a deep, frozen dampness. They would not burn. They smoldered and sputtered in the stoves, producing more smoke than heat, eating up kindling and offering little in return. Inside Ilara's cabin, it was warm. The stone floor radiated its gentle, life-giving heat. The air was clean. Boro slept soundly on the hearthstones. Ilara kept her small firebox fed with the bone-dry logs from her underfloor storage. She had to venture out only to clear the snow from her chimney and the air intake for the firebox, a short, brutal task in the biting cold. Looking out her window, she could see nothing but a world of white. The other cabins in the valley were invisible, their existence marked only by the faintest smudges of smoke that struggled to rise into the heavy air. She felt a profound sense of isolation, but also a deep, quiet gratitude. Her father's legacy, her summer of labor, had built her an ark in a sea of snow. On the 5th day of the storm, she saw movement. A figure was struggling through the chest-deep snow, a dark shape against the overwhelming white. As it drew closer, she recognized the stooped shoulders and determined gait. It was Silas. He was not wearing snowshoes. He was simply forcing his way through the drifts, a journey of a mile that must have taken him hours. He reached her porch and collapsed against the door, his breath coming in ragged, steaming bursts. Alara pulled the door open. The cold that rushed in was a physical blow. Silas stumbled inside, covered in snow, his beard frozen solid. He stared, bewildered, into the calm, warm space. He looked at the clear windows, at Alara in her simple wool shirt, at Boro lifting his head from the warm floor. He looked at the floor itself, the dark stone free of frost. "My fire, it's out," he gasped, his teeth chattering. "The wood, it's all wet." Frozen solid. Martha, she and the children, they're so cold. His pride was gone, stripped away by the brutal reality of the storm. Alara didn't hesitate. "Wait here," she said. She put on her heavy coat and boots, pulled a sled from beside the door, and opened her trapdoor. She loaded the sled with as much of her dry, seasoned firewood as it could hold. The logs were light and resonant. She handed Silas a steaming mug of broth she'd kept simmering on a hook over the firebox opening. "Take this," she said, gesturing to the sled. "It will burn hot. Get your fire going again. Then come back. Bring Martha and the children here." Silas looked from the precious wood to her face, his eyes filled with a dawning understanding. He tried to speak, but his voice broke. He just nodded, his throat thick with unspoken words. He took a long swallow of the hot broth, the warmth a shock to his system. Then, with a strength born of desperation, he turned and began the long journey back, pulling the sled behind him, a lifeline of dry wood in a frozen world. An hour later, they returned. Silas led the way, carrying his youngest daughter, who was wrapped in every blanket they owned. His wife, Martha, followed with their son. Their faces were pale with cold, their expressions a mixture of fear and exhaustion. When they stepped into the warmth of Alara's cabin, they stopped, stunned. It was like stepping into another season. "Oh, my Lord," Martha whispered, her eyes welling with tears. She unwrapped the children, their small bodies shivering violently. Alara laid more blankets on the warm stone floor. "Here," she said, "lie down here. The floor is warm." The children huddled on the stones, the gentle heat slowly seeping into their chilled limbs. Within minutes, their shivering began to subside. Boro, seeming to understand, went and lay down near them, a great furry mountain of warmth, and licked the little girl's hand. By nightfall, Alara's cabin was a refuge. 2 other families had made the perilous journey from their own freezing homes, guided by the improbable tale of warmth and dry wood. Her small cabin, once a symbol of her isolation, was now crowded with 10 people. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool and brewing soup, but beneath it all was the steady, radiant heat from the floor. Alara kept the firebox fed, her movements calm and efficient. She shared her food, her blankets, her warmth, without a word of triumph or blame. She simply met the need. Mr. Abernathy was the last to arrive. He came not for shelter, but for wood. His large, well-built house was as cold as any other. His pride was a fortress, but the cold had breached its walls. He stood at her door, his face humbled, and asked to buy some of her firewood. "It's not for sale," Alara said quietly. "But you can have what you need to keep your family warm." She loaded his sled herself. He left without meeting her eyes, the weight of the dry wood matched only by the weight of his shame. The great winter, as it came to be known, lasted for 9 days. When the snow finally stopped and the sun emerged, weak and watery, The valley was transformed. It was a landscape of immense silent beauty, but also of profound hardship. For the next month, the community worked together, digging out, sharing resources, and counting their losses. Several cabins had been abandoned, their occupants seeking shelter with neighbors. Livestock had been lost, but no people had died. The valley had survived, and at the center of that survival was Ilara's cabin. The story of the girl who hid fire under her floor spread through the valley. When the spring thaw finally came, a procession of visitors arrived at her door. It began with Silas. He stood on her porch, hat in hand, his face etched with contrition. "I came to apologize, girl," he said, his voice low. "I called you a fool. I was the fool. You saved my family. You saved this valley." He looked at the cabin, then at the ground. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to teach me." Ilara nodded. "I will." He was the first of many. Mr. Abernathy came next. He offered not just an apology, but a proposition. "I'll pay for the materials," he said. "The stone, the tools, whatever is needed, for any family in this valley that wants to build one. Your knowledge, it's worth more than any rent I could ever collect." Finn, who had been there all along, just smiled. "Told you your father was a smart man," he said to her as they stood watching Abernathy ride away. "And his daughter, too." That summer was different. Instead of the solitary work of individual wood piles, the valley was filled with the sounds of communal labor. Guided by Ilara and her father's journal, the men of the valley dug trenches, hauled stone, and mixed mortar. Ilara, once the strange, solitary girl, was now a teacher. She didn't lecture, she showed. She'd kneel in a trench, demonstrating how to fit the stones, her hands sure and steady. She spoke in the same quiet, declarative sentences, but now people listened. "The stone must be flat. The mortar needs more ash. The heat will follow the air." They called it the sunken fire system. By the first snow of the next winter, 5 more cabins had warm stone floors. The year after, 10 more. The fear of winter, the deep, gnawing anxiety that had defined life in the valley, began to recede. It was replaced by a quiet confidence, a resilience born of shared knowledge and stone. Years passed. The sunken fire became the standard, the mark of a proper home. The sight of a family hauling flat stones in the summer was as common as the sight of them cutting hay. Ilara and Finn built a life together, a partnership as quiet and strong as the cabin itself. They added a room, and Finn, under her guidance, excavated a new network of channels beneath it, tying it into the original system. They raised 2 children on the warm stone floor, children who never knew the creeping, insidious cold their parents had endured. Ilara's life was one of quiet purpose. She was the keeper of the knowledge, the woman they came to when a chimney didn't draw right or a capstone cracked. She never boasted. She never reminded them of their initial scorn. She simply shared what she knew. Her actions had spoken for her long ago, and their echo was enough. One autumn evening, decades after she had first broken ground, Boro lay stretched out on the hearthstones. He was old, his great body stooped, his muzzle white with age. His breath was shallow. He had been her first believer, the silent witness to her impossible task. He had watched her move every stone, lay every course of mortar. He had guarded her solitude and shared in her vindication. Ilara sat on the floor beside him, her hand resting on his thinning fur. Finn and their grown children stood quietly behind her. The cabin was filled with the familiar, gentle warmth. Boro lifted his head, licked her hand one last time, and then laid his head back down on the warm stone he loved. He let out one final, soft sigh and was still. They buried him in the meadow, under a young aspen tree, his grave marked by a single smooth river stone. Ilara lived to be a very old woman. She saw her children have children of their own. She saw the valley prosper, its people safe and warm, bound together by the shared secret under their floors. Her hands, once scarred from the labor of building, grew soft again, but they never lost their strength. Her hair turned the color of snow, and her quiet voice grew even softer. But when she spoke, everyone in the room would fall silent to listen. She died as she had lived, peacefully and without fanfare. It was a cold night in January, much like the one that had started the great winter so long ago. She passed away in her sleep, in her own bed, in the gentle, even warmth of the cabin she had built. The fire in the box outside had been banked for the night, but the stones, holding their heat like a faithful memory, continued to warm the room, a final, silent vigil. The people of the valley, her people, buried her beside Finn, and near the aspen tree that marked Boro's grave. They did not carve a long epitaph. They chose a large, flat piece of granite, the kind she would have approved of, and on it they chiseled the words she had spoken to Silas on that first day of the great storm, the words that had come to define her legacy. They carved the offer that had become the valley's ethos. They carved her name, the years of her life, and beneath them, the simple, profound sentence: "She kept us warm." Long after she was gone, the cabin stood. It settled into the landscape, the wood weathering to a silver gray, the stone foundation becoming one with the earth. Travelers passing through the valley would see it, a simple structure in a quiet meadow, and on even the coldest winter days, they would notice a thin, steady wisp of smoke rising from its chimney, a quiet testament to the girl who had listened to the wisdom of stone, and in doing so, had taught a whole community how to survive. The warmth she had built, buried deep in the earth, endured.